town can't ignore them. The town has responsibilities.
But they do.
The bill was drafted to make the process optional for municipalities. However, there was strong testimony in the 129th and in this session from MMA about whether or not this truly is an optional process. In the 129th, this bill did get tagged. Many proponents of this bill, and they were proponents because they were in favor of creating this due process for property owners and clarifying the scope of the public easement. I believe I've already gone through most of MMA's comments, as well as the Maine County Commissioners commented as well in opposition to this bill. I probably should step back and say, what's the difference between an abandoned and a discontinued road? Abandonment under current law occurs after 30 years of no maintenance by a municipality. Discontinuation of a road is an active process where a municipality provides notice, due process, and they actively decide not to continue maintaining a road. There is also this concept of common law abandonment, which I think was created in the 1800s by the courts, but don't quote me on that. And that basically says that if there was no use of a road for more than 20 years, it's presumed to be abandoned. There is some dispute, there is some conflict in the courts between the common law abandonment and the statutory abandonment. But that is more weeds than you want to get into.
My name is Roberta Manter. I'm the founder of Maine ROADWays, which is an acronym for Residents and Owners on Abandoned and Discontinued Ways. And I'm from Fayette, and I live on abandoned ways. Under common law abandonment, common law was in place before statutory abandonment came into play. And what it said was that after 20 years of non-use, the road could become abandoned by common law, and after that, it ceased to be a road at all. It went back to a little patchwork of private property to the center line. Now, when they said no use, that didn't mean no public use. It meant no use. And the reason I say that is because you could have a road that was only used by the abutters because it was their only access to the property, but the public wouldn't have much use for it. So after 20 years, can you say that that's no longer a road because the public hasn't used it? Well, no, you can't, because that would be depriving those properties of all access. And under the Constitution, you cannot take private property without due process and just compensation. And if you look at the case of Jordan versus Canton, they determined that access is a property right attached to the property, which cannot be taken or even damaged without both due process and just compensation. So to say that when a road has not been used by the public for 20 years, it ceases to be a road, that would deprive those people of all access. So I've always said that the best evidence for common law abandonment is the road itself. If you look at a road and it's obviously been used, then that's not a road that qualifies for common law abandonment. If you look at the road and it's got 20-year-old trees growing in it, and the bridge washed out 20 years ago and was never replaced, and nobody's bothered anybody, then that's probably a road that hasn't been used and hasn't been needed. And if no one has needed that road for 20 years, fine, let it go back to being private property. But where the road is still being used, whether it's by the landowners or whoever, you cannot get a common law abandonment. And the reason being that common law is generally determined by a court of law, not by town selectmen. The reason it has to go before a court of law is because determining common law abandonment requires a presentation of evidence to show that the road indeed has not been used for 20 years and is not needed by anyone. And they say that it was abandoned by common law and no easement remains. Well, you can't just declare that. As I said, that has to go before a court to determine the evidence.
There was some commentary around common law and changing that historically, and I think maybe it would benefit, and maybe Chair Katsifikis is the one that needs to do this, but going into what common law is and how it is developed, I think is important. You can't change common law with statute. Common law is judge-made law, and it has to get adhered to and reviewed.
That makes me think of another thing that might be good to define. There isn't a real clear definition of what constitutes common law abandonment, except 20 years non-use. And the question is 20 years non-use by who? Does that include if landowners were using it, that doesn't count because they're landowners? Does it have to be public use?
By the general public. And that's why, because it was difficult to measure that, that's why we have the presumption of abandonment.
What I say is the biggest witness for whether it's common law abandonment or not is the condition of the road. If it's got 20-year-old trees growing into it, or for example, in one case that I've been looking at now, if there is a cable across the road that has grown 20 years worth into the tree, I think that's pretty strong evidence that that road has not been used by anybody for 20 years. But if the road is perfectly wide open, you can see there's not even grass growing between the wheel ruts. That's a road that's been used by somebody. And if you say that, well, use by landowners doesn't count, take the example of where you have a half-mile road in that serves 10 residences, and then it's a dead end. And the public has no particular reason to use that road because it doesn't go anywhere, but those residences have been using it for 50 years for the sole access to their property. Can you say that because the public didn't use that for 20 years, now it's abandoned by common law and all those property owners all of a sudden can't access their homes? I say that it works one way for establishing a public easement by prescription. You have to have public use to establish a public easement by prescription, but private use can establish a private easement by prescription. But if you go the flip side of it, you can't say that in order to abandon a road, there has to be, or in order to not abandon a road, there has to have been public use. Then what happens to the private easements?
Problem with establishing those roads by prescription, whether it's public or private, is you usually have to go to court to prove it.
The other problem that runs into that, though, is if you have a road that was abandoned or that's declared abandoned, abandonment doesn't happen until the end of the period of non-use, which means that during the time that it was being abandoned, it was still a public road, which means that you can't claim a right by prescription during, by using the road for those 20 years because you were still using it as a public road. So after you've used it for 20 years, then you have to use it for another 20 years to establish a right by prescription.
You've been down this road before.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave.
And by the way, we aren't a common law country. We're a country of law. I can explain that to you some other day.
We'll have that discussion.
Yeah.
Other members of the public who would like to speak at this time, please please give your name and where you're from. Thank you.